Hello. It looks like we're getting, there's Jonathan right there. It looks like people are trickling in a little bit. Hey, let's get started. I think one of the commitments that we can make is that we will start and stop on time. My name is Paul Ironside. I am the CEO and founder of Commercial Tribe, and Jonathan is going to kick us off here this morning, and looking forward to it. So with that, let me turn it to Jonathan to get us underway. Jonathan.
Yeah. Hey, thank you, Paul. And again, let me say thank you to everyone for being with us here today. Super excited for a conversation that has a tremendous amount of momentum and enthusiasm in the market around sales management intelligence. And let me just do a little bit of housekeeping here as we get underway. And this is what you can expect over the next 30 minutes. So number one, we're going to talk about why there is a lot of momentum around sales management intelligence in the market. Give you a little bit more insight around that. Number two, Paul is going to take you through some of the data that we're collecting around where managers spent time in 2021 to influence the result. And then last but not least, we know there's questions coming out from the group. So go ahead and put those in the chat, and we'll take a look through them and kind of pick the most frequently asked ones, and we'll answer those at the end. So with that, let me go ahead and get us underway. And let me just start with a little bit of, again, why sales management intelligence has so much momentum and enthusiasm here in the market. And, you know, you guys are all familiar, I'm sure, with the revenue intelligence category. It is exploding. Forrester here says that there's a tremendous amount of money being invested in the space. And Gartner is telling us that the future is coming sooner than we think. And that's for good reason. You know, these are just some of the examples as to how revenue intelligence is absolutely changing the game in terms of how we run sales organizations. You know, for instance, you've got Clary and their ability to tell us now whether a deal should be in our forecast or not, based on how well engaged we are in an account, whether we're trading emails and messages as an example. And then you've got Gong basically telling us, you know, hey, if you want to increase the average ticket price, you need to get more multi-threaded or have more buyers in the deal. And, you know, we may have known some of these things kind of intuitively before, but really what's changed is they're now measurable and we can see them, and our organization can see them. And that has the effect of actually changing behavior amongst our team. So quick poll question out to the audience, which is, hey, do you use a revenue intelligence platform? And I'll just give folks a moment to put it in the chat if you don't mind. Do you use a revenue intelligence platform? And I'm seeing a few answers trickle in, and I see a bunch of Gong. I see Chorus, just Zoom Info just bought them. I see People.ai, I see Clary, I see a handful of others. So super clear that folks here on the call are familiar, again, with what we're talking about and the explosion that is revenue intelligence. You know, what's interesting, you know, if we define revenue intelligence for a second, this is actually Gartner's definition. They would say it's capturing seller activity, measuring deal health with that data, and then guiding sellers next to action. So that's their definition of revenue intelligence. And if we contrast that with sales management intelligence is capturing manager activity, it's measuring sales team health, and it's using that data to guide managers' next action. So when you put these two up against one another, hopefully it starts to become clear as to why we feel, and I think those that we're working with and speaking with are clear that, hey, this is kind of inevitable. This is where things are headed. And, you know, in our opinion, it's headed sooner than you think. And part of the reason is what we've all experienced over the last several months and years, which is the move to a more decentralized, distributed work environment and the need to update our sales manager playbook for that operating environment. And, you know, here's a little bit of what we've learned, you know, along the way and talking to CROs about what it actually begins to look like. We've had, you know, hundreds of interviews and conversations around this. And, you know, we think about it as with team kind of on the left, there's a set of activities. We break that out by internal versus external. And Paul's going to share some data with you here very soon as to kind of where high performing managers spend their time versus the rest to get a disproportionate result. Part of the reality is because we can't really see this on a consistent basis, there's a lot of variability in terms of where time is actually being spent. And then if you go on the right-hand side, you know, there's without team activities, and certainly important activities here that we ask our managers to do and as part of the operating rhythm, but beginning to balance these kind of left and right side and realizing that, hey, you know, if they're not with their teams, it's kind of hard to influence productivity. So how do we get the right balance is kind of a question that we often think about, and is I think hard for us to answer today for most organizations. So, as you take a look at this is kind of what we see often, which is an example of what it actually looks like. And by the way, this is kind of what it looks like at its best. Don't squint too hard at it, please, as an example of an operating cadence. But what I think I find interesting here, and despite all the SaaSification that's taken place over the last several years, this process around running our operating cadence still largely lives in a spreadsheet or a PowerPoint or a PDF. And why that matters is because we can't see it, there's a tremendous amount of variability in how it's actually being executed. And, there are issues that I think we're all familiar with around things like the Great Resignation and the cost to, hire and onboard and retention issues that we're all familiar with, where this really has a downstream impact. And, what if I were to give you the analogy? I mean, you would not roll out a sales process without understanding activity levels and how that translates to opportunities and how those opportunities translate to close one. But that is in fact exactly what we're doing when we roll out a sales management cadence is, we're rolling it out absent really a real understanding, real data as to understanding how it's being implemented and how it's adopted and how that's influencing the result. So again, our mission is to help CROs run the sales management cadence. And we do that based on where sales managers are spending time. And just like any process that you're familiar with, this isn't a stop and start. This is an iterative process. So measuring, building, monitoring, and adjusting. And let me talk a little bit about each of these. So the first step is really to understand the reality of where our sales managers are spending their time. And just through that understanding and through that analytic, we can begin to see instant changes in behavior based on the awareness around where we're spending time and where we could be spending our time better to generate a better result. And now the question often comes, okay, now that we have data on where we're spending time, where should we be spending time? And we can now begin to get more deliberate around where time ought to be spent in our operating cadence to get to a better result around our operating goals and objectives, internal, external, with team, without team. And then finally, this opportunity to say, hey, let's get this thing out of a spreadsheet. Let's begin to digitize and automate the operating calendar up to and including the events, the agendas that go in those events, the actual nomenclature associated to how we name these things and how we allocate for where we're spending and investing time, and even the shared resources that need to be put in to running these events or these disciplines to a high standard. So let me go ahead and take a breath, and I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to give Paul an opportunity to go ahead and share and tell you a little bit more about some of the data that we collected across the last year.
Jonathan, thank you for that handoff right there. And as I get this spun up right here, let me begin to take you through the data itself, and super excited about it. And again, let me again thank you for everyone's participation here this morning. All right, let's climb into it. Just some of the demographics in terms of what the study included. So first of all, we looked at 2021. So all of your fiscal years, we took that into consideration. A little more than 300 plus sales managers. You can see the breakdown by market segment. This was primarily in North America. You can see the industries represented. And then on the right-hand side of the frame right there, you can see the data elements that we captured in the benchmark. I'm going to let you maybe just kind of peruse through them as I get you guys into the specifics. I'll call them out as we define things like time with team, time without team, and get into the specifics. I will mention to you that the source of the data is coming from the calendar. So we index against, or we integrate into the calendar, and we index all of the activities that are on both Microsoft and the Google Calendar environments. With that, let me first get us into maybe starting at 50,000 feet. So we had 1,800 plus sellers that were reporting into these 300 sales managers across 2021. And I'm here to report that 38% of those individual contributors got to their number in 2021. And I think this is probably a well-known characteristics, in fact, that we're seeing in our industry, that more than half of our individual contributors arguably can't feed a family of four. We're not getting enough of our sellers to goal. And we believe that a characteristic of a high-performing manager is not just necessarily percent of plan, but it is percent of sellers at plan. And if we look at the data, I think we got off to the right start in Q1 and maybe a little bit of a hangover and spillover from Q4 coming into Q1. And then you start to see this dip in the overall performance skyline in Q3. And some of the things that we'll talk about as we talk about the operating cadence, is there a way that we can begin to understand management behavior that may be contributing to this dip in the performance skyline? And are there things that we can be doing in Q1 and Q2 to further buttress and solve for this in 2022. The next slide I'm going to take you in, I think, gets us really, really into the data. And as I put it up, let me try and frame this, this slide here. What we are comparing are sales managers, and we are going to be comparing high-performing sales managers versus lower performing sales manager. That is in the top of the frame. And in the bottom of the frame, again, we are comparing sales managers, but it's the top 50% of sales managers versus the bottom 50% of sales managers. Okay, let me draw your attention first to the top frame, and I'll try and walk you through this element as best as I can to hopefully make it make sense to you. High performing managers, what we're looking at is arguably percent to plan, those that are north of 100% of plan on an average of the 4 quarters within 2021. And if we look at the lower performing managers, this is less than 70% of plan across the average of the 2021 campaign period. So as we start to move left to right in this frame, let me start to pull out the distinct differences between the high-performing managers and the low-performing managers. And let me be perfectly clear, there are distinct differences about the way in which high-performing managers spend their time versus the lower-performing managers. The first one is this concept of percentage of open calendar hours. And it's exactly what you think it is. It's the white space that's on your calendar and so forth. And what we find is that the high-performing managers just have less open calendar time. And our interpretation of this is the fact that these high-performing managers are in demand across the organization. In other words, it's finance, it's product, it's marketing, pulling them into meetings where maybe arguably the lower performing managers just aren't as in as much demand. The second thing that we see is that they're more engaged, that they're arguably spending more time with their team. So when we look at the calendars, we find that managers are scheduled kind of interactions with their team. We see more of that happening with the high-performing managers, 50% more time spent with their team. And then the other important characteristic, and this is the one that I think is the most meaningful, and this is time that managers are spending with their team out in the market co-selling, or time spent externally. And so what we're looking at is we're looking at calendar events where we see a manager with one of their team members and a prospect and or a customer on that meeting invite. And again, what you see here is disproportionately they are spending more time than the lower performing managers. And you see this right here, not just in percent to plan, which is in the performance rating, but you also see this in percent of sellers to plan. So hopefully that top frame kind of summarized what some of the key findings that we found in conducting the benchmark study, but also when we looked at this versus the top 50% of managers versus the bottom 50% of managers, this storyline running across some of those key characteristics that I just profiled continues to hold up. All right, let's continue to kind of lean into the data a little bit. And what I'm about to take you through right here is the percentage of time that managers spent with their teams by tenure. That's the left-hand side of the frame, and then by performance is the right-hand side of the frame. So as we think about it by tenure, what you're seeing here is first, second, and third year. First years are those within their first 12 months. Second is 12 to 24. Third is 24 plus months. And as you read these two bars within the first years, what you're seeing here is of the 1,800 plus sellers, 45% of them were in their first year, or roughly 820 of them. And managers spent 27% of their time with those first years. So nonetheless, when you look at that and start to think about new hire success rates, are we spending enough time arguably with our new hires? And we contrast that on the right-hand side of the frame right here in terms of those are high tenured reps, and they make up 37% of the seller population. However, at the same time, they're actually consuming 52% of our managers' time. So our managers are, in this particular frame here, over-indexing with their high tenured sellers. Now, if we look at this by performance, low, medium, high, again, low is less than 70, mid is 70 to 99.9, and high is north of 100% of plan. What we find here is that we would like to think that our managers would be spending time with our mid performers, right? Move the middle. This was kind of the key insight that we saw at Gartner CEB. And unfortunately, that's not where our managers are spending time. They're actually spending time with our lower performers and our high performers. And these ones in the middle are arguably getting caught and not getting enough of our overall management time and attention. I think when we begin to put these two elements together, I think probably comes the most kind of provocative insight that we found in this study. Let me quickly break this down for you. So again, you're looking at tenure of the rep here. So first, second, and third year. And then what you're looking at is also the performance component in here. So within the first year, we have our first year low performers, mid performers, and high performers. And then what we've done here is you see again, you're looking at the composition of the sellers. So 15% of the total population of the sellers in the study were first year low performers. And if you go to the far right-hand side, what you're seeing is 20% were third year high performers. And then the bar right next to that one is the time component. So the way to read this is our managers spent 9% of their time with 15% of the population, which was first year low performers. And I think the thing that gets interesting is when you just look at this big red bar right here. And when you look at this, what we're finding is that despite the fact that we 10% of the total seller population here is in what we characterize as high tenured underperformers, look how much time they're consuming of our managers. I characterize it as the greatest drag on sales managers. There's probably a couple of different ways that we can characterize that. But if we think about this high tenured underperformer taking 25, a quarter of the overall time of managers, could that time potentially be repurposed across the organization? And so I know this has been a subject of a lot of debate internally amongst our clients, nonetheless. So let's argue we keep driving into this. This frame here is one that we continue to work on. And what you're looking at right here is the operating cadence. And so when we index all of the activities on a manager's calendar, ta-da, we kind of bubble them up into these word trees. And so when you look at this and see, weekly updates, all hands, leadership meetings, interviews, TCOS, ops, what are these elements? What we thought we would see are things like pipeline review and forecast review and deal reviews, et cetera, and so forth. The elements that are actually on the operating cadences that sales leaders are publishing to their teams. That's not what we find. We find this kind of fruit salad of different events. What I call a pipeline review, Jonathan calls a pipe review, this other one calls a one-on-one and so forth. So the nomenclature of the operating cadence is not standardized across the organization. And probably the best way to make this point is when we start to talk about the parallel of a management operating cadence versus a sales process. And when we go out and we talk to sales leaders, what we find is, do you have a sales process? Absolutely. Is it defined? No doubt about it. We got definitions, we got exit criteria, and then we instrument it. And I say, okay, well, great. So as we think about that particular process, would it be okay? The question that we ask is, would it be okay if a sales executive decided to change the name of the discovery call? I'm going to change it to this, another one, change it to that, or change the definition, or change the way that we instrument it? And the answer is, of course not. Of course not. We're standardized on that. However, when we look at the management operating cadence, we tolerate or allow our managers to interpret this in different ways. And we think that what happens here is, it drives confusion inside the organization, no standardization. It puts pressure in kind of interesting ways on ops in terms of the requests that are coming in terms of reporting and so forth. I think there's a really, really big opportunity for us as a leadership team and so forth to focus in on standardizing on this dimension, and more to come on this for sure. So as I kind of get to the end of this and kind of wrap up, let me maybe give you some best practices or things that came out that we would certainly suggest you take into consideration. The question we get is, well, Paul, how much time should my managers be spending, here and there? And in terms of time with team, the way in which we actually see the high performing and best practice, about 20 to 30% of their time is actually spent with their team. Of their total time, 8, 10, 12%, we would suggest they are spending in the field with their teams co-selling. So that's anywhere, depending on the length of a call, it's 4, 5, 6 calls, sales calls per week. as we think about the individual contributors and so forth, are there ways that we can begin to redirect capacity from the high tenured underperformers? Definitely, but also high tenured, and redirect that towards the less tenured middle performers, and start to focus on those individual dimensions there. The operating cadence, kind of the point that I was making on the other slide. Can we begin to just reduce the number of events or disciplines, focus in on those, and drive standardization across them? I don't know how many times that when we ask the question, do you differentiate between a pipeline review and a forecast review and so forth? People say, kind of, sort of. It all kind of ends up in the one-on-one. I think there's a real opportunity for us to focus in on these particular events and drive more rigor and discipline into them. Span of control, we get the question all the time. It's about 6x-ish in terms of what we find to be the optimized span across managers. And the other one here, and in fact, we're a new thread of research is going on internally around just the composition of team from a tenure standpoint. What we find, or what we think we're going to find as we're looking at the early part of the data set, is that new managers are well fitted for newer reps, and more tenured managers tend to be better fitted for more tenured sales executives. Maybe an intuitive type of a comment there. And then the last one here we think is super interesting, and this is the concept of manager comp plan. Can we begin to change the composition? So no doubt about it, we're in a make or miss business, and it's percent to plan. But can we begin to carve in to a management comp plan, not just percent to plan, but percent of sellers to plan? And we're starting to see more progressive sales leaders engineering these concepts into the overall frame. With that, let me pause here for a minute. I'm going to stop sharing, turn it to Jonathan, see if anything's coming through in the chat, and take some questions.
Paul, thank you for that. And thank you to all of you for your questions. I've just been kind of sitting here, taking a look through the chat and cataloging what's coming in. There's a bunch of kind of common questions. Paul, I'm going to fire them at you. So, question number one that kind of is coming at us is, so how easy is this to get set up in terms of getting to some of the insights that you shared, and what level of involvement do we need from our sales managers?
Good question. We're trying to design this in a frictionless way. And one of the things we certainly have an appreciation for is that sales leaders, sales executives, enablement ops, and so forth just aren't going to tolerate things that have got lots of friction to them. And so the design principle was, hey, can we actually connect into the calendar? And we only need one single contributing calendar to actually begin to come in through the hierarchy and pull and index all of the data. So arguably, we need one kind of calendar connection into Microsoft and or Google, and we can begin to index, the entire hierarchy. And then we enrich the data with tenure and performance. But what we're trying to do is make it as kind of effortless as we possibly can to initially give you a baseline.
Awesome. Another question that we're getting, and we do get this one from time to time. So this question's around, hey, you guys talked a lot about data on the calendar. Are you guys looking at other data sources? Some examples, Salesforce, Gong, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. We started with the calendar, and the reason we started with the calendar is when we design these operating cadences. So these are structured operating cadences, and they have structured elements to them, and they are intended to get woven into the calendar. So that's where we started. And the idea is, can we begin to look at how managers are spending their structured time versus unstructured time, if you will, in the disciplines that have been outlined. So yes, over time, we will certainly add those elements, but that's why we started with calendar.
Paul, I'm seeing a lot of this question. So question is, how do you get managers comfortable with the fact that we're now pulling and having access to this type of data?
Yeah, it's a good question. A couple of things. One is I do think the conversational intelligence companies, the Gongs, the Choruses, have arguably paved a way for us. We've created a ton of transparency in the recording of sales calls with our prospects and customers, and coming through the transcription process. So I think there's a kind of an already transparent process that's kind of washing over the commercial space. I think that's number one. Number two is managers are pulling this. One of the things that we find when we come in is that managers want to know what their peers are doing. and where they're spending time. How much time are they spending in X or Y or Z types of scenarios and so forth? So we're seeing this interesting pull from sales managers to get them more and more visibility into, into the data itself, which has certainly been an encouraging thing for us.
Thank you. So there's some questions on kind of the impact of this. So great, you guys are pulling some data, interesting data. How does this actually get to changing behavior in the organization?
I refer to that as the so what, and maybe that was in the questionnaire. So what I'm looking at is so what, Paul, what now? Sometimes I use a little bit of a silly metaphor, this example of, at the end of the year, a calendar year, when you get your credit card statement from Visa, MasterCard, American Express, whatever it is, and they kind of catalog it for you and so forth. They're like, oh, wait a minute. Did we really just spend $3,200 at Starbucks on Frappuccinos? It's kind of this, well, wait a second. And immediately what you start to do is change your behavior. And actually it's referred to, there's a specific scientific term to coin to it called the Hawthorne effect, which is now that we see the data, we can immediately begin to act on it. Where am I going with this? When managers start to see their own data and begin to compare that against other managers, how much time are they spending in the market co-selling? How much time are they spending with new hires, et cetera, et cetera? Depending on those values and what the differences are between managers, they start to take an immediate behavioral change towards them. Again, where we find kind of interesting aspects that's getting to immediate change.
I'm going to grab one more. So the last one I want to fire at you is around this concept of the operating cadence. So there's some questions here around, hey, great data. How does this actually help you run a better operating cadence?
Yeah, good question. Well, first of all, you can see it. That's, I think, probably the most important thing is I think we know a ton about, how sellers sell. I think we do. We've instrumented that, things that you talked about with, Clary and Gong and Chorus, et cetera, earlier in the call. I think we know very, very little about the way managers manage. So the very first thing we can do is help provide you this baseline framework in terms of where your managers are spending time in this construct of your operating cadence. And you may say, hey, I don't really have one. Well, by default, you actually do have one. Your managers are operating. You may think you have one very, well defined. We can start to help you understand where your managers are indexed across that. And then we can start to work with you about, all right, what do we do next? And how do we begin to design that? And start to leverage some best practices that we've collected along the way that tie back to your financial assumptions and so forth, and the way in which you construct these individual disciplines and define them, understand which reports and supporting resources come to help contribute to making managers better in those individual ceremonies themselves.
Paul, thanks for answering those questions. And I want to thank everyone for taking a few minutes out of their day to be with us. We will, in follow-up, send you a copy of the recording. We're going to send you a copy of the benchmark report in the deck. And there's also a product tour that you can access on our website, and we'll send you a copy of that as well to learn a little bit more. And certainly if today's conversation has been interesting, we'd love to spend more time with you and learn a little bit more about what your goals are and how it aligns to what we've discussed today. With that, let me say thanks, and we'll see you guys soon.
Thank you.